All right, everybody, welcome. This is a lecture on interpretive issues in Hebrews 4:14 through 7:28. A couple things just before we get started with this section. One, this is the section of the book that most people get lost in. This is the section that you're reading along. You're like, yeah, Jesus is the ultimate revelation from God. He's greater than angels. He's greater than Moses. We get that. We make it through the Exodus generation stuff of chapter 3 and chapter 4. And now we launch into a discussion about high priests and Levitical high priests. And then the author pulls out Melchizedek. And, and if you're reading this, you are automatically just in, I don't know where did this come from? How is this working? And then to top that all off, he then stops and enters into this probably the most significant and drastic of the warning passages, the most severe of the warning passages in the book of Hebrews, only to come out of that into a discussion about Abraham and then to resume his argument about Melchizedek back in chapter 7. So the argument about this high priesthood of Jesus is going to begin here in 4:14, but it's not going to end until really the end of chapter 7, and it is going to be a long and windy road. And Melchizedek is this shadowy figure, and even some of the arguments that the author is going to make by modern standards are like, oh, Levi was in the loins of Abraham, and therefore, so anyway, buckle your seatbelts, and I'm going to make just a few observations as we move through this lengthy passage as we move along. All right. So the author starts in with, or he continues, back in 3:1, he has broached the topic of Jesus as a high priest. And that's going to raise a lot of questions in people's minds, because what does qualify Jesus as a high priest? It's not his lineage. He's not from the tribe of Levi. He's from the tribe of Judah. So how is he a high priest? But the author here is going to say, okay, we have this great high priest, and this great high priest has passed through the heavens. And that's, if he's looked back with high priest in 3:1, now passed through the heavens is going to be anticipating what he's going to say about Jesus going into the heavenlies to offer his blood in chapters 8 and 9. And as we talk about a high priest, and we're going to talk about what qualifies Jesus, what qualifies someone as a good priest, is there's going to be two things. One is that he is sympathetic, and also that he has been appointed. And so we're going to talk. We're going to see from 4:14 really to 5:5 these two themes of sympathy for the people he serves, as well as an appointment from God. So we have a high priest who's able to sympathize with our weaknesses, and of course, hearkening back to this affinity that Jesus has with his brothers and sisters in chapter 2, here we have this idea that he is tested as we are. Yes, he is in all things been made like humans, but he is without sin. And this is going to allow then this idea that as he approaches the throne of grace with boldness as a high priest with blood, that we may also approach the throne of grace with his blood in boldness, and we might receive mercy and find grace to help. A wonderful passage. I mean, this passage preaches very well here. Now he's going to enter into a discussion about what are Aaron and the Levitical high priests like, and he talks about this idea, what that means. But here again, we have this idea: these high priests, these human high priests, are able to sympathize with weaknesses, and these human high priests also offer a sacrifice for their own sins as well as for the people. And we see here, so this issue of sympathy is here. But we also see in chapter 4, verse 4, he doesn't presume to take the honor, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. And this is hearkening back to Exodus 28, Leviticus 8, where Aaron and Aaron's family are appointed as the high priests. And Aaron, of course, is from the tribe of Levi. Moses is also from the tribe of Levi. But this issue of being called by God. So sympathetic to the people and called by God are what qualify generally, these general qualifications of priests. And so now the author is then going to move into and talk about how does Jesus fit these qualifications. And we see the first thing he says is, look, Jesus didn't glorify himself. He was appointed. And so here's this idea of being called by God. And in order to do this, he quotes Psalm 2:7, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And he quoted that back in chapter 1 and 2. And then he enters into, he quotes another psalm, which is going to play a major role in the book from this point forward, where he says, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." And so Psalm 110:4 is going to be an important verse here. And this is also where the idea of Melchizedek is coming in. So as we move into chapter 5, we see how does Jesus fit this bill of being called and sympathetic. So Jesus is, in the days of his flesh. This is an interesting phrase just because of the idea of, this is an allusion to the historical Jesus, to the life of Jesus. And this life of Jesus is the episode. We have to, and commentators are split on this idea of where this episode is, where he offers up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard. And so probably the majority of commentators look at this as a Gethsemane episode where Jesus is weeping and crying out to God, "Take this cup from me." But it's interesting too that he's crying out to the one able to save him from death, but he does die after the Gethsemane episode. But perhaps this is referring to the resurrection as well. Perhaps this could be the tears and crying out. This could be the episode of Lazarus in the Gospel of John. But the commentators are a bit split on this question, but this is an interesting allusion to the life of Jesus, which we don't get a lot of in the book of Hebrews. All right, as we move on, we see that the sympathy, his learning of obedience through suffering is something that Jesus' people do, and so this is this part of being sympathetic. And of course, so sympathy, and then he has been designated by God as a high priest of the order of Melchizedek. All right, so here, this is where it gets, right as he's gone through and he's talked about what makes a high priest. How is Jesus a high priest? And he says Jesus is a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And just when you would expect that there's going to be some explanation of that, he launches into this, all right, guys, I have a lot to say, but you are all dull. Now, here's where in 5:11, this phrase about this is a relative pronoun in Greek, and it's ambiguous about who it's referring to. It could read about whom we have much to say, but the question then is, who does he have a lot to say about? And there really are three different options as to what the author is trying to communicate to them and what they are having a hard time hearing about. One is this whom, about whom we have much to say, could be Jesus. I have a lot to say about Jesus, and it's hard to explain, but you've become dull of hearing. It could also be, maybe the most obvious sense, is we have a hard time hearing about Melchizedek. They might have had a hard time hearing about Melchizedek. So about Melchizedek we have much to say, and it's hard to explain. The NRSV, when they translate, they say about this we have much to say, and that probably is alluding to this idea that the author has a lot to say about the high priesthood of Jesus, and it's difficult to explain because you aren't really understanding. So this question is a big question simply because why is the author launching into this very difficult warning about this whole episode in the high priesthood? So anyway, all that to say, whatever he's doing here, we're going to talk about this warning passage in week 9 where we look at all the warning passages together. So that's that. So he goes through this warning passage. I highlighted dull and sluggish because they are the same word in Greek, and they are probably what constitutes the beginning and end of that passage. They are the inclusio words, the hook words that form the bookends of that. So the author then comes out of this, and he's going to start talking about Abraham and Melchizedek. He's also going to kind of reassure the audience after he's just kind of lambasted them about falling away and the impossibility of repentance, and the ground that soaks up the water, it only produces weeds, is going to be burned. But then he says, all right. Look, God has given an oath about promises to Abraham. And that oath is certain. And it is an oath that we can take refuge in. And it says something about the importance of Abraham. It says something about God's reliability, and this idea that he showed to the heirs of his promise the unchangeable character of his purpose. He guaranteed with an oath. These two unchangeable things, an oath and that God won't lie. These are great things to take refuge in. And so right after this, it's impossible to renew to repentance. He's all, look, if you want a sure and steadfast anchor for the soul, you got to get behind Jesus. And then he goes back into this idea of Melchizedek. So I'm not going to say too much about Melchizedek, because you all are going to do your group work this week on Melchizedek, and you'll look at Genesis 14 here. You'll look at Psalm 110 for the whole Psalm of 110, and I've also given you 4Q or 11Q Melchizedek, which is a Dead Sea Scroll in which Melchizedek is talked about in the Qumran area among the Essenes about who is Melchizedek. So this idea of who is Melchizedek. Now, the interesting thing about Melchizedek is the author says, all right, who is this guy? And he says he is without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. And with this said, that this idea of the without father, without mother, without genealogy, we wonder, who is Melchizedek a divine figure? Is he a pre-incarnate Christophany? And some commentators will go that route. Probably the idea of Melchizedek is he shows up with no warning in the text, and he disappears without any trace in the text. And the author kind of seizes upon that to say, we don't know where he came from, but we know he did not come from the lineage of Levi, because Levi had not been born yet. And we also know that that he resembles Jesus in the fact that he seems to have this indestructible life. So I personally do not take the idea of a Christophany, that Melchizedek is a pre-incarnate Christophany of Jesus in the Old Testament. I think that Melchizedek serves as an interesting kind of shadowy figure. We don't know where he came from. We don't know how it all ended. And the author says what that means is that he does not have the genealogy of that we would expect of a priest, and yet he is the most durable of priests that we see in the Old Testament. The author is then going to launch into, in chapter 7, verse 4, he's going to make this argument here, and my cursor has disappeared here, but he says, one might even say in verse 9, Levi himself, who received tithes, paid tithes to Abraham. And this is the argument that Abraham is greater than, or that Melchizedek is greater than Levitical priests, in that Levi, not being born yet, was still, and we might not get this argument, is still present in Abraham when Abraham makes pays his tithes. Therefore, Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, because Melchizedek blesses Abraham, and we see that that the greater blesses the lesser. All that to say, you're going to work through this passage and talk about why Melchizedek is important here. And here we have the idea that Jesus did not descend from Levi, he descended from Judah, so how can he be a high priest? And we're going to see here in 7:15 and 7:16 that Jesus is not a high priest through the legal requirement of physical descent, but through the power of an indestructible life, which he is going to say Jesus has resurrected. He is like, or we should say Melchizedek is like him, in the sense that that Melchizedek seems to abide perpetually, and here Jesus has this indestructible life, and that is what qualifies him for this appointment as a high priest. All this to say that all of this is confirmed with an oath. Abraham was confirmed the promises to him with an oath, and now we're going to see that Jesus has been appointed with an oath. And so again, by these two, if we revisit that idea in chapter 6, by these two undisputable things, that unchangeable things, that God can swear with an oath, that's unchangeable, and he will not lie. And so this idea that Jesus is a priest appointed by an oath, and God will not lie, and so that for that reason, he is the guarantee of a better covenant. We see some of the beauty of Jesus, that he holds this priesthood permanently, and so he can do this forever. And of course, this idea of forever is coming from Psalm 110:4. You are a priest forever, and Jesus is going to continue forever. That's going to be this kind of midrashic interpretation on Psalm 110. So Jesus is going to be a better priest in this sense, exalted above the heavens. And we're going to see that the author is going to end this section by anticipating a section that is going to come in chapter 9, in chapter 8 and 9, in which he's going to talk about Jesus going into the heavenly tabernacle to provide a sacrifice on Day of Atonement style. And this is going to anticipate 9:11 through 14. So here we have. So I don't know how much that's clarified anything, but certainly we have this idea of Melchizedek, and in your group work, every one of you is going to have to write a little paragraph on what is the author accomplishing in this section. Why is Melchizedek so important to the argument of this section? And you're going to have to do some work with that. But enjoy that. This is this is the most difficult section of the book, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys have to say.